The clock on the wall of the clinic ticked steadily, its rhythmic sound echoing faintly in the otherwise silent room. Ethan Blake leaned back in the hard plastic chair, scrolling aimlessly through his phone. The pale light of the waiting room was dim and cold, casting sterile shadows on the walls. This visit was long overdue, a routine checkup he had pushed off for months. But his sister's constant nagging had finally worn him down. He glanced at his watch. 30 minutes had passed since he signed in. And the room was still empty except for him and an older man flipping through a dated magazine across the way. Ethan sighed, standing to stretch his legs, his tall frame brushing against the edge of a mounted pamphlet rack. Just as he considered heading to the reception desk to inquire about the delay, the door to the exam rooms creaked open. A nurse appeared, clipboard in hand. She looked young, likely fresh out of nursing school, with a no-nonsense demeanor that matched the stark white scrubs she wore. Her dark hair was tied neatly into a ponytail, and her sharp eyes scanned the room before they landed on him. "Ethan Blake?" she called, her voice calm and professional. Ethan nodded and followed her through the narrow hallway lined with faded health posters. The faint scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, reminding him of how much he disliked doctor visits. The nurse motioned toward an exam room and gestured for him to take a seat on the padded table. "Dr. Owens will be in shortly," she said, her tone clipped and efficient. "I just need to take some preliminary notes." Ethan gave her a polite nod, trying to appear relaxed, though the sterile atmosphere of the room set him on edge. She sat down on a rolling stool, pen poised over her clipboard. "Let's start with some basics. Any changes to your medical history since your last visit?" she asked, her gaze flicking up to meet his. "No, nothing's changed," Ethan replied. "Still healthy, at least." "I hope so." She offered a small, polite smile before continuing with her questions, her tone neutral and detached. But as the minutes ticked by, Ethan noticed something shift. Her demeanor softened, her eyes lingering on him a little longer than necessary as she scribbled her notes. At first, he thought it was his imagination. Perhaps she was just thorough, focused on her job. But the air in the room felt different now, charged. "Almost okay," she said, standing and setting her clipboard aside. "We'll need to check a few things. This shouldn't take long." Ethan nodded, his heart rate picking up slightly, though he wasn't sure why. She moved closer, reaching for the blood pressure cuff hanging on the wall. Her hands brushed against his arm as she wrapped the cuff around it, and the contact sent a faint, unexpected jolt through him. He shifted on the table, feeling uncharacteristically self-conscious. "Relax," she said softly, her tone warmer now. Her eyes flicked up to meet his, and he could see a faint glimmer of something. Curiosity? Amusement? He wasn't sure. Ethan cleared his throat. "I am relaxed." She raised an eyebrow, the corner of her mouth quirking into a slight smile. "Your heart rate says otherwise." Ethan chuckled awkwardly, trying to shake off the tension building between them. "Well, you've got a way of making people feel on edge." Her expression softened, and she shook her head lightly. "That's not my goal. I'll do my best to change that." She tightened the cuff, her fingers brushing against his skin again. And Ethan found himself acutely aware of how close she was standing. Her presence filled the small room, the sterile atmosphere giving way to something warmer, more intimate. The faint scent of her perfume, a subtle, floral note, drifted through the air. And Ethan had to force himself to stay still. "All right. Blood pressure looks good," she said after a moment, removing the cuff. "Next? I'll need you to." The door creaked open, and the doctor stepped in, clipboard in hand. The tension in the room dissipated instantly, replaced by the familiar awkwardness of routine exams. Ethan breathed a quiet sigh of relief, though he couldn't shake the strange electricity that had passed between him and the nurse. The doctor greeted him with the usual pleasantries, her demeanor friendly but brisk. The nurse remained in the room, standing near the counter, her gaze flickering toward Ethan every so often as the doctor conducted the exam. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on answering the doctor's questions. But the weight of her presence lingered. The rest of the checkup passed uneventfully. But Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the nurse. Her touch. Her gaze. The way the air had felt heavier when they were alone, it all stuck with him as he left the clinic and walked to his car. He told himself it was nothing. Just a figment of his imagination. She was a professional doing her job. And he was overanalyzing a routine interaction. But as the days passed, he found himself replaying the encounter in his mind, questioning whether he had misread the moment or if there had been something real between them. When he received a follow-up call from the clinic a week later, just a courtesy check to ensure everything was fine, he hesitated before answering. The caller ID displayed the clinic's name. But as he picked up the phone, a small part of him wondered if it would be her voice on the other end. It wasn't. It was a receptionist, cheerful and efficient, confirming the details of his next appointment. But as he hung up, Ethan realized he was already looking forward to going back. The morning of his follow-up appointment, Ethan couldn't shake a strange sense of anticipation. He told himself it was ridiculous. This was just another routine visit, nothing special. Nothing to get worked up about. But as he pulled into the clinic parking lot, he caught himself glancing at his reflection in the rearview mirror, smoothing his shirt and running a hand through his hair. He stepped into the clinic, the familiar antiseptic smell greeting him once again. The waiting room was busier this time. A few other patients scattered in chairs, their faces buried in phones or magazines. Ethan approached the front desk, gave his name, and was told to wait. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before the nurse finally appeared again. She had the same calm, professional air, clipboard in hand, though her sharp eyes softened when they landed on him. "Ethan Blake," she called, her voice clear and composed. He stood, trying to appear casual, and followed her through the same narrow hallway. This time, he noticed the faint scuff of her shoes against the tile floor, the slight sway of her ponytail as she walked ahead of him. The same sterile exam room awaited, and she motioned for him to take a seat on the table. "Good to see you again," she said with a small smile as she set her clipboard down. There was something different in her tone, something warmer, more familiar. "You too," Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the faint tension coiling in his chest. "Back for round 2. I guess." She chuckled softly, pulling on a pair of gloves. "Nothing too intense today. Just a follow-up to make sure everything's looking good. Shouldn't take long." As she moved closer to him, Ethan couldn't help but notice the way her presence seemed to fill the room again. She was close, closer than she needed to be, it seemed, and he felt the same prickling awareness as before. "Let's start with your pulse," she said, reaching for his wrist. Her fingers wrapped around it gently, her touch cool but firm. Ethan watched her face as she concentrated, her gaze flicking between his wrist and the watch on her other hand. "You're tense again," she observed, her lips curving into a faint smile. "You weren't lying about not liking doctor visits, huh?" Ethan shrugged, his pulse quickening under her touch. "Not exactly my favorite way to spend a morning." She let out a soft laugh, her fingers lingering for just a moment too long before she released his wrist. "Well, I'll do my best to make it quick and painless." There it was again, that subtle shift in the air. that quiet intensity between them. Ethan tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the bland posters on the wall, the faint hum of the overhead lights. But when she leaned in to check his blood pressure, her shoulder brushed against his, and he felt his breath hitch. "You okay?" she asked, her voice low, almost teasing. "Yeah," Ethan replied quickly, clearing his throat. "All good." She stepped back, jotting something on her clipboard before setting it aside. "All right," she said, her tone light but laced with something unspoken. "I'll need to check your abdomen next. Go ahead and lift your shirt for me." Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second before complying, pulling his shirt up to expose his stomach. The cool air of the room hit his skin, and he felt her hands brush against him as she adjusted the stethoscope around her neck. Her touch was professional at first, measured and precise, but as her fingers lingered just slightly, Ethan felt the tension in the room thicken. "Breathe in," she instructed, her voice soft but steady. Ethan obeyed, inhaling deeply as her hand pressed gently against his side. Her fingers were warm now, the touch firm yet oddly comforting. She moved the stethoscope across his skin, her gaze focused, her lips pressed into a slight line. But then, for just a moment, her eyes flicked up to meet his, and the intensity in her gaze sent a jolt of something electric through him. "Your heartbeat's racing a bit," she murmured, tilting her head slightly. "Nervous?" Ethan let out a soft laugh, though it sounded forced even to his own ears. "Guess I'm not used to all this attention." Her lips curved into a small smile, and she stepped back, letting the stethoscope fall around her neck. "Well, everything sounds normal so far," she said, her tone light but with an edge he couldn't quite place. He lowered his shirt, watching her as she made a few more notes on her clipboard. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken tension. Ethan thought about saying something, breaking the quiet, but before he could, she turned to him again, her expression unreadable. "There's just one more thing I need to check," she said, her voice calm but quieter now. "It's part of the follow-up." Ethan nodded, his throat dry. "All right." She stepped closer, her fingers brushing against his arm again as she adjusted the cuff of his sleeve. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it left his skin tingling. Her movements were careful, deliberate, as if she were acutely aware of the space between them and how little of it there was. For a moment, Ethan thought he saw something flicker in her expression, hesitation, perhaps, or curiosity. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by her usual calm professionalism. "Relax," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "This won't take long." Ethan tried to relax as instructed, but the energy in the room made it almost impossible. He couldn't quite pinpoint what it was about her presence, maybe the way her movements seemed so precise yet intentional, or the way her gaze lingered just a fraction longer than necessary. Whatever it was, it left him hyper-aware of everything: the faint hum of the lights, the sterile chill of the air, the quiet rhythm of their breaths. She moved closer, her clipboard now set aside on the counter. "Let me just check a bit further," she said softly, her tone professional but with an undertone that made his pulse spike. "I'll need you to sit back for this part." Ethan complied, leaning back against the paper-lined table. He let out a slow breath, trying to ignore the way his heart thudded in his chest. She reached for his arm again, adjusting his positioning slightly, and her touch felt even warmer now, more present. He could feel the brush of her fingers against his skin as she worked, her movements smooth and deliberate. The silence in the room stretched between them, the weight of it almost unbearable. Ethan found himself focusing on the small details: the way her brow furrowed slightly as she worked. The faint scent of her lotion. The warmth of her fingers as they rested briefly on his wrist again. It all felt so strangely intimate. Like they were the only two people in the world at that moment. Still tense, she murmured, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft. Almost teasing. But there was a gentleness to it that made Ethan's breath catch. You need to relax. I'm trying, he replied. His voice quieter than he intended. She glanced up at him then. Her sharp eyes meeting his. For a moment. There was something unspoken in her gaze, a flicker of recognition. Of understanding. As if she could feel the same charged energy that he did. The corner of her lips quirked up in a faint smile. And she stepped back slightly. Giving him a moment to breathe. All right, she said after a pause. Her tone steady once more. One more thing to check. And then you'll be all set. Ethan nodded. Swallowing hard. He was acutely aware of the way her eyes lingered on him as she reached for her gloves again. There was nothing overtly inappropriate about her actions. But the subtle tension between them was undeniable. She reached for his shirt. Her fingers brushing lightly against his skin as she lifted it higher. Just checking for any tenderness, she said. Her voice calm and even. Ethan tried to focus on her words. On the clinical explanation. But the warmth of her hands against his abdomen made it difficult. Her touch was careful. Deliberate. As she pressed gently along his side. Her fingers tracing slow. Measured paths. He could feel the heat radiating from her hands. The faint pressure of her fingertips. And it sent a jolt of awareness through him. Does this hurt? She asked. Her gaze flicking up to meet his. No, he managed to reply. His voice slightly strained. She nodded. Her hand moving slightly lower as she continued her examination. The closeness. The way her touch lingered, it was all becoming too much. Ethan's breath hitched as her fingers brushed against him again. And he swore he saw a flicker of something in her expression, something softer. More personal. You're fine here, she said softly. Her voice almost a whisper now. But she didn't pull back immediately. Instead. Her hand rested lightly against his side for a moment longer. Her fingers grazing his skin in a way that made his pulse race. Ethan couldn't stop himself from looking at her. Really looking at her. There was a warmth in her eyes now. A quiet intensity that mirrored his own. The air between them felt heavy. Charged. As if they were teetering on the edge of something unspoken. She started to say something but stopped. Her lips pressing into a thin line as she stepped back abruptly. Her hands moved to the counter. Busying themselves with the clipboard and pen as if to put distance between them. Ethan sat up, slowly. His shirt falling back into place. The room felt colder now without her touch. And he found himself missing the warmth of her presence. He wanted to say something. To acknowledge the strange tension that had been building between them. But the words wouldn't come. Well, she said after a moment. Her tone brisk and professional again. That's everything for today. You're good to go. Thanks. Ethan replied. His voice steady despite the turmoil swirling inside him. She nodded. Her expression unreadable as she opened the door for him. Take care. Ethan. As he stepped out into the hallway. The tension in his chest remained. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. That the routine checkup had turned into something far more complex. And as he walked back to his car. The warmth of her touch still lingering on his skin. He knew he wouldn't be able to stop thinking about her. The drive home was a blur for Ethan. The faint scent of antiseptic still clung to him. And every time he shifted in his seat. He could almost feel her touch again, gentle yet deliberate. Lingering in his thoughts. He turned on the radio to distract himself. But even the rhythmic beats of his favorite playlist couldn't drown out the memory of her hands. The warmth of her gaze. He parked outside his apartment, sitting in the car for a moment longer than usual. The sterile white walls of the clinic had felt so far removed from his ordinary life. But now they seemed to follow him. The memory of their interaction replaying in his mind like a film on loop. Why did it feel like something more had happened? Why couldn't he let it go? Inside his apartment, Ethan busied himself with small tasks, watering the plants, tossing together a simple dinner, but his mind kept wandering back to her. Her voice. Soft yet steady. Her hands. Confident yet tender. The way her gaze had lingered on his. Just for a moment too long. He sat down at the dining table. Fork in hand but appetite gone. His phone buzzed with a text from his best friend. Liam. Liam, how was the checkup? Did they finally tell you to cut back on the junk food? Ethan smirked, shaking his head. He typed a quick reply. Ethan, clean bill of health. Thanks. And no. I can still eat more fries than you. He set the phone down. But his thoughts refused to stay in the present. Instead, they drifted back to the nurse, her sharp eyes. The subtle shift in her expression when their gazes met. There had been a moment. Hadn't there? Or had he imagined it? He exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Reading too much into a routine exam. And yet, the feeling in his chest, the strange mix of anticipation and confusion, refused to go away. A week passed. And Ethan managed to push the memory of the clinic to the back of his mind. Work kept him busy. And his evenings were filled with plans to meet friends or hit the gym. Still, every now and then, he'd catch himself thinking about her. Wondering if she remembered him the way he remembered her. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when his phone rang. The clinic's number flashed on the screen. And his stomach did a small flip. He stared at it for a moment before answering. Hello? Hi. Ethan, came the familiar voice. It was her. This is Natalie from the clinic. How are you? Her tone was professional. But Ethan couldn't help but detect a hint of warmth beneath it. I'm good, he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. What's up? I wanted to follow up on your last visit, she said. The doctor reviewed your results. And everything looks great. But we noticed a slight irregularity in your blood pressure readings. It's probably nothing. But we'd like you to come in for a quick recheck. Are you free tomorrow? Ethan hesitated. Was this just routine? Or was there something more to her call? Yeah. Tomorrow works, he said. His curiosity outweighing his hesitation. Great. Natalie replied. And for a split second, he thought he heard her smile through the phone. See you then. The next day, Ethan found himself back in the same sterile exam room. The faint antiseptic smell was exactly as he remembered. And his nerves were slightly more on edge this time. He told himself it was just a follow-up. Nothing more. But the moment Natalie walked in, clipboard in hand, he knew this visit would feel anything but routine. Ethan, she greeted. Her voice calm yet warm. Thanks for coming in. No problem, he said, sitting up straighter. Better safe than sorry. Right? She smiled, setting the clipboard on the counter. Exactly. Let's get started. As she took his blood pressure, her fingers brushed against his arm again. Just like before. The touch was light, clinical, but the awareness between them was still there. Hanging in the air like an unspoken question. All good, she said after a moment. Stepping back. Your readings are perfectly normal this time. That's a relief, Ethan replied. But his voice came out softer than he intended. Natalie hesitated, as if she wanted to say something more. Instead, she turned to jot something down on her clipboard. You've been taking care of yourself, right? Eating well. Exercising? Yeah, he said, watching her. I've been trying. Anyway. She glanced over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. Good. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with something Ethan couldn't quite name. He felt like there was more she wanted to say, more that he wanted to ask, but neither of them moved. Well, Natalie said finally, breaking the quiet. That's everything for today. You're free to go. Thanks, Ethan said, standing up. He hesitated for a moment, then added, It's nice seeing you again. Her smile returned, softer this time. You too. Ethan left the clinic with a strange sense of anticipation. Like something had shifted again, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Over the next few days, he found himself thinking about Natalie more often, wondering if she felt the same pull that he did. Their third encounter wasn't planned. Ethan had stopped by a nearby coffee shop on a Saturday morning. And as he stepped inside, he saw her sitting at a corner table, a book in her hands. She looked different out of her scrubs, more relaxed, yet just as striking. For a moment, he considered walking past, leaving her to her peace. But something about the way she glanced up and caught his eye made him change his mind. Natalie, he said, approaching her table. Hey. She looked surprised, but pleased to see him. Ethan. Hi. Mind if I join you? He asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Not at all, she said, closing her book and setting it aside. As they talked, the tension that had lingered in the clinic seemed to dissipate, replaced by an easy, natural connection. They laughed about the awkwardness of their first meeting, shared stories about their lives outside the sterile walls of the exam room, and found themselves lingering over their coffee long after their cups had gone cold. By the time they said goodbye, Ethan knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. Ethan didn't expect to feel this way, this drawn. He told himself it was just the coincidence of running into Natalie at the coffee shop, that the way she laughed, a low, melodic sound, shouldn't echo in his mind long after they parted. But it did. And every time he thought of her, there was that same lingering warmth. Something was shifting between them, though neither had said it aloud. A few days later, his phone buzzed. Natalie, I hope I'm not overstepping, but do you want to grab coffee again? Not an exam this time. I promise, smiley face. Ethan grinned at the screen, his fingers quickly tapping out a reply. Ethan, absolutely. You just tell me when. When they met again, it was a quiet corner of a park. Not the coffee shop. Natalie had suggested it, saying she wanted to enjoy some fresh air after a long week at the clinic. Ethan brought coffee for them both. Her order memorized, a latte with a touch of caramel. She smiled when he handed it to her. And for a moment, he couldn't help but think how natural it felt, this exchange. They sat on a bench under a sprawling oak tree, the late afternoon sun casting dappled patterns of light and shadow around them. The conversation flowed easily at first, work frustrations, funny anecdotes, but as the minutes stretched on, a deeper, quieter connection began to form. You know, Natalie said softly, her gaze fixed on the horizon, I wasn't expecting to meet someone like you. Ethan tilted his head, curious. Someone like me? She hesitated, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. Someone who makes me feel like I can let my guard down. It doesn't happen often. Her vulnerability caught him off guard. And for a moment, he didn't know what to say. But then he smiled, leaning forward slightly. The feeling's mutual. She looked at him then, her eyes searching his face as if trying to decipher something unspoken. The air between them grew heavier. Not with tension, but with a quiet intimacy that neither of them could ignore. When her hand brushed his, just a light, accidental touch, it felt deliberate. Neither of them moved away. They didn't speak about it. But after that day in the park, something changed. Their conversations became longer. Their interactions tinged with a warmth that felt undeniably personal. Ethan found himself looking forward to her texts, to the way her words always seemed to carry a hint of a smile. And Natalie started to let him in. Little by little. It was during one of their now frequent coffee meetups that Ethan noticed the shadow behind her usually bright demeanor. "You okay?" he asked. His tone gentle but insistent. Natalie hesitated, her fingers tracing patterns on the side of her cup. "I'm fine," she said. But the words felt hollow. Ethan leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You don't have to tell me. But, if something's bothering you, I'm here." Her shoulders sagged slightly, and she let out a soft sigh. "It's just, work's been overwhelming lately. Sometimes it feels like I'm giving everything I have. And it's still not enough." Ethan didn't speak right away. Instead, he reached across the table, his hand resting lightly over hers. The touch was gentle, meant to comfort. But it sent a spark through both of them. "You're more than enough, Natalie," he said quietly. "Don't ever doubt that." She looked up at him then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. For a moment, it felt like the world around them faded, leaving only the two of them and the connection that seemed to grow stronger with every passing second. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. And when her fingers curled around his, neither of them let go. Ethan didn't expect Natalie to show up at his door that evening. But when he opened it to find her standing there, her hair slightly damp from the rain, he wasn't surprised. "I needed to see you," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of something she couldn't say over the phone. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. She entered, her eyes taking in the cozy warmth of his apartment, the bookshelves lined with novels, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. Ethan led her to the couch, offering her a blanket before sitting beside her. For a while, they just talked, their voices soft as the rain tapped against the windows. Natalie opened up in ways she hadn't before, sharing stories of her struggles at the clinic, of the pressure she felt to always be perfect. Ethan listened intently, his hand resting lightly on hers, grounding her. "You don't have to be perfect," he said after a while. "You just have to be you." She smiled then, a small, tentative smile that made his chest tighten. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," he admitted. "But you don't have to do it alone." Their gazes met, and the air between them shifted. Slowly, hesitantly, Natalie leaned in, her hand resting against his cheek. Ethan didn't move, didn't breathe. As her lips brushed against his, a soft, tentative kiss that deepened as they both gave in to the pull between them. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't urgent. It was a slow, gentle exploration. Each touch, each kiss, carrying the weight of everything they hadn't said aloud. Ethan's hand found her waist, pulling her closer, while Natalie's fingers tangled in his hair, anchoring herself to him. When they finally pulled apart, their foreheads resting together, Natalie let out a soft laugh. This wasn't how I expected tonight to go. Me neither, Ethan admitted, his voice low. But I'm not complaining. They stayed like that for a while, wrapped in each other's arms. The world outside forgotten. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Just them. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows, Ethan woke to find Natalie still nestled against him, her breathing soft and steady. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. He knew this wasn't the end of their journey, far from it. There would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt and fear. But as he watched her stir, her eyes fluttering open to meet his, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, they would face it together. In the weeks that followed, Ethan and Natalie fell into a rhythm, their bond deepening with every shared moment. But it wasn't all perfect. The intimacy they'd found was both exhilarating and daunting, unearthing vulnerabilities that neither of them had anticipated. One evening, as they walked through the park after a long day at work, Natalie hesitated before speaking. Sometimes, I wonder if this is too much. Too fast, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan stopped walking, turning to face her. The sincerity in her voice caught him off guard. But he understood. Natalie, he said gently, there's no rush. We don't have to figure everything out right now. She nodded. But there was a tension in her posture that didn't ease. It's not that I don't want this. I do. But, what if we're not ready for everything that comes with it? Ethan took her hands, his thumbs brushing lightly over her knuckles. We'll take it one day at a time. No expectations. No pressure. Just us. His words seemed to ease her worries. And when she smiled, it felt like the sun breaking through a clouded sky. Their relationship wasn't a secret, but they'd kept it private, cautious of how it might be perceived by those around them. Natalie, especially, was wary of how their growing closeness might affect her professionalism at the clinic. But one afternoon, as they shared lunch at a quiet cafe near her workplace, a familiar voice called out, "Natalie?" She turned to see Dr. Hargrove, her supervising physician, standing at the counter. Her stomach twisted into a knot as she watched him approach their table. "I didn't realize you had company," he said, his gaze shifting to Ethan. "This is Ethan," Natalie said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "We've been spending some time together." Dr. Hargrove studied Ethan for a moment before nodding. "Well, it's good to see you taking some time for yourself, Natalie. You work too hard." As he walked away, Natalie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Ethan reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "You okay?" She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Yeah. I guess I just needed to stop worrying about what other people think." Things came to a head one night when Natalie had a particularly grueling shift at the clinic. A patient had taken a turn for the worse, and she blamed herself, even though everyone around her assured her she'd done everything right. When she arrived at Ethan's apartment, she was emotionally drained, her defenses worn thin. Ethan took one look at her and knew something was wrong. "Talk to me," he said, pulling her into his arms. At first, she resisted, burying her face in his chest as tears spilled over. But as he held her, whispering soft reassurances, the floodgates opened. She told him everything, her fears, her doubts, the pressure she felt to be perfect. Ethan listened without interrupting, his arms a steady anchor. When she finally fell silent, he cupped her face in his hands, his eyes meeting hers. "Natalie, you're human," You're allowed to feel this way. But don't ever doubt how incredible you are. His words were like a balm, soothing the ache in her chest. And as she leaned into him, she realized just how much she needed him, not as a crutch, but as a partner who made her stronger. As the months passed, their relationship continued to grow. They learned to navigate each other's quirks, to communicate openly about their fears and dreams. Ethan started spending more time at the clinic, volunteering to help with administrative tasks just to be close to Natalie. And in turn, Natalie began to open up about her life outside of work, sharing pieces of herself that she'd kept hidden for years. One evening, as they sat on the couch in Ethan's apartment, Natalie glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever think about the future?" she asked. Ethan looked at her, surprised by the question. "All the time," he admitted. "And lately, you're in it." Her breath hitched at his words, her heart swelling with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "I think about it too," she said softly. "And I want you there, Ethan. For all of it." It was a quiet Sunday morning when Ethan decided to take the next step. Natalie was curled up on his couch, her hair in a loose ponytail, wearing one of his sweatshirts as she sipped her coffee. She looked so at home, so completely at ease, that it took his breath away. "Natalie," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, "I need to ask you something." She looked up, her brow furrowing slightly at the seriousness in his tone. "What is it?" He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Her eyes widened, her coffee forgotten as he opened it to reveal a simple, elegant ring. "I don't want to rush you," he said quickly. "But I also don't want to wait. I love you, Natalie. And I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy. Will you marry me?" Tears filled her eyes as she looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes, Ethan. 1,000 times yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling slightly. And when he pulled her into his arms, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. A year later, Natalie and Ethan stood together in the garden of a small, picturesque venue, surrounded by their closest friends and family. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the scene as they exchanged vows. "I promise to stand by you, to support you, and to love you," Ethan said, his voice filled with emotion. "Not just for today, but for every day after." Natalie's smile was radiant as she took his hands. "And I promise to let you in, to trust you, and to love you with all that I am. Always." As they kissed, the crowd erupted into cheers. But for Natalie and Ethan, the world faded away. In that moment, it was just the two of them, starting a new chapter together. And as they danced under the stars that night, Natalie rested her head on Ethan's shoulder, a content smile on her lips. She knew that life wouldn't always be easy. But with Ethan by her side, she was ready for whatever came next. Together, they had found something rare and beautiful, a connection built on trust, vulnerability, and an unshakable love that would carry them through anything.